Okay, sure.
Okay, inshallah. All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasul al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum. Once again, happy to the opportunity to give another presentation. So this one is a little bit more niche. I had the opportunity to come across some of Ali Shariati's work a few months back, and I would say, really influenced by the way that he thinks and the different ideas that he propagated during his time in Iran before the revolution, and during the time of the Shah of Iran and things like that. And we'll touch on that just a little bit, maybe towards the middle of the presentation. But this is really a focus on his life, his intellectual influences, the impact that he had during his time as an ideologue and an intellectual in Iran, his tragic death, and the influence that he had on the young people within the nation. So we'll just dive right in, get right into it, inshallah. So the breakdown of this presentation will be, I hope it's not as long as the last one. I think the last one that I gave was like almost an hour. So I'll just do a very brief, kind of deep explained biographical overview of his upbringing and his intellectual influences and things of that nature. And then we'll go through some of his actual, ideas, like how was he able to, synthesize European thought and more like leftist Marxist ideas into the Islamic framework. And then we'll just maybe have a kind of a discussion. Hopefully, I hope we can maybe have some type of discussion about the significance of his thought today. So we'll just go over his biography quickly, and throughout his biography, there'll be some just some images or some basic explanations of certain highlights, I would say, of his life. So this is an image of him right here. This is him in the center of the image. I think this is a graduation that he's at, but he was an intellectual in Iran, so always around young people, young students, and things of that nature, and that really had a large impact on the effectiveness of his ideas during the time that he was the leading lecturer in one of the biggest cultural centers in Iran. So a basic overview of his timeline: he was born in 1933. He was born in a small village in the outskirts of the urban areas, and he was raised in a scholarly home. His father was an intellectual as well. His father was also a classically trained scholar, so he had a lot of influence of scholarly works as well. So his father was a reform-minded cleric, so he was a part of the ulama class, if you will, but his mindset and his approach was in line with Reformation and trying to change the approach of the way that Islam is taught and propagated amongst the masses. And he influenced his son in many different ways. So one of the things that him and his father did was join a group called the Muslim. Let me see. It's called the Muslim group of the Muslim the group of God worshipping socialists. So this acronym right here, MGWS, is the Muslim group of God worshipping socialists, I believe. So they're very interested in more radical, if you will, more radical work, more left-leaning work, and they kind of like a book club, if you will, where they brought a lot of young people and reform-minded people together to discuss more radical ideas about how can Iran, Iran have its own sense of self-autonomy, and what can be done through the utilization of the religion of Islam, as well as the synthesis of Islamic thought with more Marxist, socialist, left-leaning thought. How can there be kind of a synthesis between the two that holds on to the tradition, but also seeks to have a progressive nature in regards to economic policy, political policy, and social interactions and things of that nature. So from a young age, he was very deeply interested in left-leaning, more radical work that really influenced his thought. And as we'll see, he took that interest all the way throughout his entire life. And he was also engaged in activism. He organized demonstrations, a lot of student demonstrations and things of that nature. And he was arrested because of that multiple times. So here's an example of one of the projects that he worked on actually in his early 20s, I believe. So he wrote a book, or he translated a book that was written by an Arab scholar that was focusing on the life of Abu Dhar, which is one of the most famous companions of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam. The book was talking about how Abu Dhar, as an individual, he was very anti-establishment. He was very anti-caliphate, especially during the time of Uthman, due to the fact that the caliphate, as it expanded, it began to develop like a lot of wealth, and the focus on justice and giving to the needy and the poor slowly began to shift, and the focus more so was predicated upon expansion and pushing for a bureaucratic, more institutionalized form of Islam, instead of the Islam of that Islam that was focused on bringing people together and establishing justice upon the earth. So the book that he wrote, he didn't really write the book, Shariati. He didn't write the book. He translated an Arabic writing, or an Arabic script that was called Abu Dhar, the First Muslim Socialist, right? So this kind of gives you an idea of like his thought, his ideology, and what he was really focused on as an intellectual. But over time, as we'll see, like his thought and his ideas progressed, and he was able to kind of get a more solidified, more of a solidified identity in his thoughts and his ideas. So continuing on, by the time he reached his adulthood, he initiated his scholarly career by working in education, specifically elementary education. And he initiated his scholarly path in 1958, where he studied Arabic and French. He got a master's degree in languages and literature, and he studied Arabic and French. And he utilized his knowledge of French as a tool to study in a French university. So after a few more years after he graduated from his master's, he had the opportunity to get a scholarship and to move to France and to study specifically Islamic history, so the history of Islamic civilization, as well as sociology. Social theory, sociology, understanding social relations and how society develops and things of that nature. And one thing to note about him is that although his father was a cleric, and he did spend a lot of time studying traditional texts and traditional more religious theoretical disciplines, it wasn't necessarily his strong suit, nor was it something that he found to be I wouldn't say something that he didn't find to be beneficial. Rather, it wasn't his main focus. His main focus was not necessarily preservation of the normative Islamic tradition. Rather, he saw the Islamic tradition, the Quran, Sunnah, the different sciences that circle around that, such as tafsir and jurisprudence. He saw those disciplines as a tool to be able to apply to more progressive thought. So he never separated himself from his Islamic roots and principles and foundation, but his approach was more progressive and I guess you could say revolutionary, so to speak. So here's some quotes from a biography that was written about him. It says that in Paris, at the height of the Algerian and Cuban revolutions, he immersed himself in radical political philosophy as well as in revolutionary student organizations. With his newfound access to the French language, he immersed himself with new ideas that he did not have access to before. But he also, at the same time, continued to sharpen his ideas by engaging critically with Western thought and synthesizing Islamic principles with other ideologies. So a perfect example of this is Frantz Fanon. So Frantz Fanon was a third world psychiatrist, but also a philosopher as well. He's a social philosopher and psychosocial philosopher. And he was in Algeria. He was fighting with Algerians during their revolution against the French. And one of the things that Fanon spoke about in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, which is a book about it's a book that talks about the I guess you could say the kind of like guerrilla warfare and pushing back against Western imperialism and colonialism, specifically in the context of the Third World. So one of the things that Fanon spoke about in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, is the idea that people within the Third World, specifically, North Africa and the Middle East and Asia, right, countries that were colonized by Western European powers, countries that were colonized by these powers, they need to let go for them to be able to see for them to be able to gain their own independence and have their own self-determination and their own autonomy. They need to be willing to let go of their religious foundational, tradition. This is what Fanon says, that they need to let go of religion in order to be able to have that autonomy, right? But Shariati, when he reads this, is one of the things that he reads during his time in university in France. When he reads this, he actually wrote a letter and sent it to Fanon, saying that I disagree with you. Rather, I think that for Muslim, in the context of Muslim land specifically, for us to be able to gain our sense of self and a return to our own sense of autonomy and self-determination, Muslims, rather than forsaking their religious identity, they need to return to it. They need to return to their religious principles and their religious roots. One of the things that Fanon talks about as well is having more a violent struggle, a violent uprising against the oppressor, against the white colonizer, right? And Shariati, he sees this as, in the Islamic context, as jihad, right? Not in the jihad in nafs sense, but rather in like the actual physical going out and fighting on jihad, like as a religious obligation. So these are the ways that Shariati was engaging critically with Western thought, right? A lot of Muslims will say that they're very anti-modernity, anti-modernist thought. There's a lot of critiques that come against Islamic modernism and Islamic modernist thinkers such as Iqbal, Shariati himself, and other, ideologues of the 20th century, right? But for him, And a lot of the Islamic modernist thinkers, like, they present kind of a third way, that does not fully submit to the products, if you will, of modernity, the philosophical and ideological products of modernity, such as Western capitalism, and on the other side as well, Marxism and socialism and things of that nature. Rather, what they do is that they try to establish like a third way, right? Holding on to by holding on to Islamic principles, holding on to like the Islamic identity, the identity of what it means to be a Muslim and its essence, right? And formulating a third way that's authentic and still has roots within the tradition and the religion of Islam. So he is one of, Shariati being, he is one of many ideologues and thinkers and intellectuals of the 20th century that sought to revive Islam through utilizing Western thought, right? Engaging critically with Western thought, engaging critically with like the ideas of like, Karl Marx and others, even like Nietzsche and things like that, right? Engaging critically with those philosophers, with those like sociologists and economists, right? But also taking the resource material of the traditions of Islam, right? The lives of the companions of the Prophet himself, and other ulama that came throughout Islamic history. So this is just kind of like a taste of the of his experiences within the Western world, within Paris and things like that, So moving on, he returned to Iran in 1965 after his time of study. In the initial years of his time in his return, he was kind of he went back to his village to teach for some time. But after 2 years, he had the opportunity to begin giving lectures at the largest cultural center in Tehran, the capital of Iran. And it's called the Husseiniya Irshad, which is kind of like it pays homage to the martyr Hussein, who was the son of Ali, who passed away, or who was brutally murdered in Karbala. So this is kind of pays homage to him. And he spoke there, and he would teach there for a brief period, only 5 years, from 1967 until 1972. But during that period, he rose in popularity and in fame due to the way that he was able to orate his ideas, the way he was able to express his thoughts, right? He really had a grip on the minds of the youth of that time, the way that he was able to synthesize different ideas and to explain in a way that was so clear, but so impactful. He really he had a very popular place within the minds and the hearts, especially of young people. But over time, like the Iranian government, and this is during the time of the Shah, right? This is after the coup that came in, I believe, 1953. No, I think we'll get to that in just a little bit. But this is during the time of the Shah, who was Western backed. So a lot of the ideas that Shariati was propagating, there was a conflict of interest between the two, between the Iranian government as well as Shariati and his followers. So the institution was shut down by the Iranian government due to his popularity and due to the fear of, due to the fear of of his following and the amount of impact that he had within society. So he was arrested after that, but due to petitions from different places across the world, such as in Paris and different cities in Iran, he was let go. He was let go in 1975, and in 1977, he fled from Iran to London, and mysteriously he passed away. Nobody knows the reason behind why. Some say it was a heart attack. Some people believe it was a deliberate murder? Nobody knows. But he mysteriously passed away in his apartment complex, in his apartment home, in 1977 in London. And interestingly enough, his body was transported to the Baqi' in Medina, and the body that he's buried next to is actually, it's the body of one of the daughters of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. I believe it's Zainab. So he's buried, Adi Shariati is buried right next to her. One of the daughters of the Prophet, I believe it's Zainab. I have to check to make sure, but be that as it may, he's amongst good company. He's amongst good company. So yeah, going through just a little bit, this very brief overview of the kind of the context of Iran during that time. So this is during the 1950s and the 1970s. Famously, after the World War era, there's kind of the independence movement across the third world. So in the 1950s and the 60s and the 70s, a lot of third world nations were, fighting, Western imperial powers in order to gain their own autonomy and independence ultimately. And it's no different for Iran. In 1953, there was a man named Mohammad Mossadegh who was elected the first democratically elected official of Iran. Right, there was still like the Shah during that time, but you can kind of think of it as like the Queen of England, in the England Parliament. Like it's kind of just like the Shah was just. It was kind of just like for show. It was kind of aesthetic, it wasn't really anything like no actual like, material power, but more of like an aesthetic soft power, if you will. So Mossadegh was the first democratically elected official of Iran. And one of the main reasons behind why he was elected as the prime minister was because of his promise to nationalize the Iranian oil, right? Because before this, England, the UK, and Winston Churchill, they struck a deal basically with Iran that kind of privatized the oil, and the oil, like the amount of oil that they had there, really, it wasn't benefiting the Iranian people. So Iran and the prime minister Mossadegh, he promised to nationalize the oil, and that's exactly what he did. But obviously, like any nationalization effort, Western Europe and colonial powers, they didn't like that. So the UK and the United States collaborated in order to construct a coup. I can't remember the year when that was, but it was in between, I think maybe in the 60s or something like that. A coup was in place, and Mohammad Mossadegh was put on house arrest, and he passed away in house arrest. And instead, what they did is that they put the Shah of Iran. They placed the Shah as kind of like a puppet dictator or puppet leader that backed Western interests. And of course, this caused nationwide dissent, but the hard power comes into play, and there are a lot of crackdowns on demonstrations and things of that nature that sought to push back against this, this policy. And this is where we have over time, this caused a lot of heat to muster up amongst the masses, especially the youth. And Shariati's ideas, his thoughts, his philosophy, his approach, that just added more fuel to the fire, and that's why he was silenced and exiled from his country essentially. But although he never lived to see the revolution take place, no one can deny the amount of impact that he had, the amount of impact on the youth ideologically that he had in the construction of the revolution to take place 2 years after his passing. So that's just a little brief overview of like the history of Iran. And this, I mean, this is like this history can really help to get frame a good understanding of modern international relations between the United States and Iran. You know, this is still, this revolution hasn't been, the regime that was propagated after revolution in 79 has not been toppled, you know. So the relationship between Iran and the Western world is still very sour, as we, you know, over the past like 3 weeks, we've seen that. So I hope this brief overview can maybe help someone get a good understanding of that. So now we'll get into his ideas. So in essence, his his main idea, his main focus, his main ideology was taking Islam away from uh, taking Islam away from the dogmatic, clerical, more ritualistic, hermetic faith, and shifting it to become, and not even shifting it because it is, but just helping people to gain the consciousness that Islam is a tool to engage critically with society and provide solutions to concrete material issues. It's not about changing Islam, but it's just about reframing the thinking about what Islam is. You know, it's sometimes it's whenever, if especially for those who were born Muslim and raised Muslim, like a lot of the things that you're taught are like the dogmas and the ritualistic aspect of it, you know. So this is how you pray, this is how you fast, this is how you do this. It becomes personal piety, right? But it's sometimes like we forget like the role that the Prophet played in changing the way that Meccan society during his time, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, the way that he was able to shift the way that Meccan society and the Quraysh, how they operated, you know. Like we're talking about, you know, slavery, like more unjust slavery, and burying young women alive, daughters, burying, like fathers would bury their daughters alive. Um, the aristocracy of Mecca, right? The main tribal leaders of Mecca using the Hajj as a tool to gain personal profits, you know, and personal benefit, right, at the expense of a lot of people. These were the realities during the time of the Prophet, right? And the Prophet, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, like he shifted and changed literally, drastically, dynamically the way that society operated from then, from that point onwards, right? So this is kind of the same approach that Shariati takes and a lot of Islamic modernist thinkers take, such as Iqbal and others, you know. So I'll just go through some quotes that he has to say. Here he says, therefore, the goal is to bestow upon their contemporary fellow men a common and dynamic faith and help to acquire self-awareness and formulate their ideals. So you can see like the goal he's talking about the intellectuals here, where he says the goal is to bestow upon them, their community, the people around them, the people amongst them, right? A dynamic faith, a faith that seeks to understand like their place in history and what, you know, what is taking place currently, presently in our time, in our society, right? To help us acquire a sense of strength and a sense of understanding of who we are, where our place in the world is, and what needs to be done in order for us to be, in order for, you know, justice, if you will, to be established upon earth for our people, as well, for our people, for Muslims, as well as those non-Muslims who are being exploited or being treated unjustly as well, right? So this is not, he's, like I said earlier, maybe if you all remember this, he wasn't very focused on the theoretical approach to Islam. You know, he wasn't focused on the intellectual discussions or debates that nobody really understands, nobody really knows entirely. Only Allah knows those things. I think that was something that we spoke about in the chat, I think last week, you know, where we get so caught up in the different like very minute masail that we become divided, you know. And this is something that he talks about later that we'll get to, you know. But the point is like, we just need to focus on the essentials. We need to focus on the essentials of our Islamic faith. What is, how do we pray? How do we fast? Those things are important, but also like the spiritual, uh, 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 the spiritual principles. What is justice? How do we uphold justice? How do we, how do we attain prosperity, material prosperity? Things like this. And the next quote that I have here says, "History had taught Europe that Islam was not a religion, confining its followers to the isolation of its temples." Right? So anti-hermetic faith is not like, a Buddhist type of faith where like they're focused on like hermeticism or something like that, right? Was not a religion confining its followers to the isolations of temples without paying attention to the world and what happens in it. Islam is a religion which swiftly generates motion. It creates power, it provides self-awareness and enlightenment, and incites political sensitivity and social responsibility relative to one's own destiny, right? So you can kind of get a understanding, like this is a really good quote that really sums up his ideas. You can get an understanding of like this faith seeks to like, it's progressive, not necessarily in the not necessarily in like the like changing the way that changing the sources or the source material of the religion, but understanding where we are as Muslims in society, and what can be done in order for us to, if there are things that compromise our values as Muslims, what can we do? What can be done in order to be able to rectify that, and to change that, you know. So one of the other things that he speaks about, one of the other ideas that he propagates, is the role of the Muslim intelligentsia in society, right? So he is a little bit more critical of the clerical class, of the clergy, if you will. And what's interesting is that if you look in Islamic history, like the phenomenon of the organized clergy or the organized church, it's not necessarily, it has no historical precedence. It's a more recent construction, right? Throughout Islamic history, like the scholars, if you will, the scholarship, it was very decentralized. There wasn't a centralized church like there was in Christendom, like the centralized Catholic Church that 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 decided a lot of the political realities during that time in Europe. In the Muslim context, that wasn't the case. It's more of a recent thing. So he says that the ulama, in the sense of traditional scholarship, are more so preservers of the tradition than they are proponents of social change within society, right? So the ulama have their place, right? They seek to preserve the source material of the tradition, the hadith, the different, specific arguments that took place between certain scholars throughout Islamic history, preservers of the tradition, right? Not necessarily like theorists about social change, if that makes sense. I mean, there are like, a select few. There are some that do have, even in like, current times, there are some that do have like that, who are able to hold on to both, but it's a dime a dozen. It's not too much, right? Um, so that's the role of the ulama, right? But the role of specifically the intelligentsia, right? Um, they they're focusing on like how can we as a society progress forward as a Muslim community? What needs to be done in order for us to progress forward? How can we take responsibility upon ourselves to be able to progress? So yeah, as I said before, like Shariati, he's a member of that class of intellectuals. Specifically in the 20th century, you have Jamaluddin Afghani, Rashid Rida, and other scholars like that, who took a lot from European thought, who looked at Europe and didn't fully submit to their approach, the European ideology, but they took from their ideas, and they kind of shifted it, if you will, or they kind of sifted those ideas through the filter, an Islamic filter, and came up with a third way, as I had talked about earlier. So they sought to revive Islam and revitalize the masses who in their eyes had regressed due to the retelling of the tradition rather than an eye looking to the future, using Islam as their compass. So a few quotes from Shariati. He often stressed that the return to true Islam would not be led by the ulama, like I said, but by the progressive Rushan Fikran, which is the Persian word for intelligentsia. Let's see. So in What Is to Be Done, which is a book that he wrote, or actually it's a collection of his speeches, actually. That's what Is to Be Done. He insisted that progressive intellectuals were the genuine exponents of dynamic Islam. And he talks about this when he says that the role of the prophets, when you think of the role of the prophets, whether it be Prophet Moses or Jesus Christ, alayhi salam, and the prophets, like the role that they had to play was to introduce a different way of thinking, right, and a new way forward for the people of their time, whether it be Moses and the Israelites, against the Pharaoh, and the Prophet, as I spoke before as an example, against the aristocracy and the mushrikun of Mecca. So so getting into the applications of Islam. So this is kind of like where it comes in a full circle. This is just my own reflections, and maybe after the presentation, we can have kind of a discussion about this. So some of the things that I took from that, what can we learn from his thought, is that we should be critical in our analysis of the Quran and the traditions of the Prophet. One of the things that he says is that the prophets often emerge among the masses and were able to communicate with the masses to introduce new mottos, project new vision, start new movements, and beget new energies in the conscience of the people, peoples of their time and places. And this is something that, if any of you have read The Islamic Secular by Dr. Sherman Jackson, this is kind of along the lines of what that book is about as well, right? Using the Islamic tradition as a tool to be able to have like a new way that's not necessarily like it's not necessarily within the specific, if you will, like clear-cut principles or commandments of Islam, right? But it still falls underneath that divine gaze. It still falls underneath that gaze of Allah, and Allah is ever watching. Allah sees all. Allah knows all that takes place, So if we come in different community spaces, in different like social constructs and things like that, and we begin to use Islam not necessarily as a transmission of dogma, but as our guiding compass to establish new projects and programs and initiatives, then we're also falling in line with the approach and the ideas of the prophets that came before us. So the second reflection that I took from this is that we must be able to identify where we find ourselves presently, right? And this can only be done through a deep study of history as well as the other social sciences that come around that. Only then can we come to an understanding of the right way forward. So he says, in a nutshell, the enlightened soul is a person who is self-conscious of his human condition in his time and historical and social setting, and whose awareness inevitably and necessarily gives him a sense of social responsibility. So they say that, whenever you learn something new, that acquired knowledge, it should become a burden upon you, right? The more that you know, the more responsible you are. the more responsible you are for, for establishing some type of change, you know. So with the development of knowledge and understanding who we are, where we find ourselves in the present in the present time, we become more burdened to do something with that knowledge that we gain, right? And that actually leads me into the final point, that the acquisition of knowledge must be done in order to act upon it, right? Um, in one of his books, Shariati, he says, at most, the scientist discovers the facts, right? Whereas the enlightened person identifies the truth, right? And while the religious and secular knowledge can be helpful for enlightened awareness, they are not the desired, they're not in and of themselves the desired light. That kind of knowledge which is emphasized in Islam is an awareness unique to man, right? A divine light and a source of consciousness in the social conscience. So he speaks about the divine light, right? When you say like knowledge is a light, that's how knowledge is explained in the Islamic tradition. Knowledge being a light, something that gives you a sense of direction, or it helps to clarify your path in the darkness, right? If I just have the light, and my path is clear, but I don't actually take the step forward to walk upon that path, what was the benefit of getting the knowledge in the first place? If I'm just going to stay put, the purpose of the knowledge is to be a light that clarifies your vision, and when you see that path, you initiate your steps and you walk upon that path, right? So the acquisition of knowledge is not necessarily just for some people. For some people, it may be for preservation, like we spoke about before, like the ulama, like their goal is to preserve the tradition, right? And that's important. That is important. We need to understand our tradition, But for majority of us, the laity, we're not. I mean, maybe someone here is, but I'm not a scholar. Majority of the people here are not necessarily scholars or anims. The majority of us, the knowledge that we gain, it's it needs to be, um, prioritized. It needs to be prioritized knowledge that helps us to think or develop solutions to issues, to problems, and to progress forward in a meaningful, impactful way. So I wanted to wrap up and conclude with a quote from Shariati in one of his books. He said that, I hope soon to see the day when the present state of affairs, which is colored by pessimism, cursing, and evil teaching perpetuated among Muslims by the enemies of Islam, in order to instigate trouble between them so that they can forget the real enemy, will be transformed. Instead of wasting their energy on differences, as well as accusing, cursing, humiliating, rejecting, and condemning one another, all Muslims should follow the true Islamic teachings and enjoy friendship and understanding. I hope this day is not too far away. It will be the day when our modern university students, along with those of the religious schools, Hawzat, our professors, it will be the day when our modern university students will be along with those of religious schools, our professors along with their ulama, our illiterate believers along with the intellectuals, our youth along with the elderly, our modernized along with the traditionalists, our daughters along with their mothers, our sons along with their fathers, will be able to sit together and defend each other in a united struggle against the plots facing Muslims. And I think that there's no better way to conclude than that. At the end of the day, the most important thing is to be united, and I don't mean that in a kind of like an arbitrary sense, but rather in the most literal way possible. You know, um, no matter like the way that we were taught, the way our upbringing, the way that we were, or our specific, like, our specific ideology, or the things that we hold most important in our lives and most valuable in our lives. It should never be an excuse or an impediment to Muslims being able to come together and to push for change. not only domestically here in America, but abroad in different parts of the Muslim world. And I think that what's being done here at mine and other efforts that I've seen are really beginning to sift through all the nonsense, all the, the hawa, all the hot air, all the differences and the theoretical differences and the sectarian differences, and really focusing on prioritizing what can we do as a community to be able to attain prosperity and success and revive our international ummah once more, and I think there are even a lot of really beneficial efforts taking place right now. I'm not I don't know what people's opinion are of the Democratic candidate of the mayor in New York, like Mamdani, but there are some people, this is like an issue that needs to be really, this is an issue that needs to be really addressed, is that some Muslims will be like, oh, well, he's not Sunni, so like we shouldn't support him, or he's like Ahmadi or whatever, so we shouldn't support his who he is, or like we shouldn't support or be behind him in this effort, and this is the type of thinking that's going to keep us in this disempowered state. This is the type of thinking that prevents us from being able to like actually, do things, do material, like produce like material results in the real world. If we keep on talking about these differences, so so yeah, this is one of the concluding quotes, and I'll just open up the door for any questions that anybody might have or comments, inshallah.